let me show my VM that I have on here, and we will take a look at some cool things that we've got to show off. So one of the very first things that we can do with MDX is we can look at how to write a basic query. One of the things that's tough to do sometimes is learning how to skip an axis. So if I really only want to return just one piece of information or one row of data or one list of data without rows or without columns, we need to be able to return just that list of members with no data associated with it. So naturally, we probably want to put that data on rows so we can scroll through them nicely. However, MDX says you can't skip an axis. So if you want something on rows, which is axis number 1, we have to use all the previous axes before, which in this case would just be columns. So is there a way to do that? Yes, there is. The easiest way to do it is we can select an empty set right on this axis right here. So we've selected an empty set, just open curly braces. And we've got all of our customer members on our rows, and we're going to run that. And there we go. We've got our customer list. Now, if we wanted to make that more complicated and a little bit more useful, we can modify that parameter to have a filter on it, just like we did here. So we're going to use the filter function. We're going to say, I want to filter all of my members, and I want to see only members where in string, this is a VBA function we're using, I want to see where in string their name has the phrase John. So that could be, a guy with a first name of John, a guy with a last name of, Johnson or Johnston or any other variation of that. So let's go ahead and run that and see what we get instead. That should filter it down. Yep, so we've got Abigail Johnson, Alexander Johnson, all of these folks whose last name or first name potentially have John in it, John Smith, John Clark, etc. So again, a very simple query to start off with, but we've got our select statement, our axes, which are critically important, so our columns axis, which is 0, our rows axis, which is 1, and then we have a from statement, and it's going to come from our cube, our AdventureWorks cube that we're using, and of course from our AdventureWorks analysis services database. Then when we added some filtering, all we did was do all of our filtering right here inside the axis. We can stack those functions, and that's really where the power of MDX comes in. The power of MDX is not in the ability to run a filter, because we can do that in T-SQL. It's in the ability to leverage multiple functions on top of each other to enable a lot of additional functionality. The idea behind this is if you put a cube or a measure or a calculated measure with a non-constant expression on axis 0, you'll slow down the query. So in a data set in AdventureWorks, you won't always notice this, but depending upon the measure's definition, the number of members in the hierarchy. So, for example, if you put sales amount on columns, that measure would have to be evaluated for each member in the rows. Do we really need those values? No, not really. The only thing we really need is a list of members. So that's why we're using an empty set. A lot of folks I see will just plug a measure in there because they don't know they can use an empty set. So you don't have to use a measure and evaluate that all the way down and take all of that performance hit. So good little tip there. The next thing we want to talk about is something that's pretty common and something you'll run into if you're building calculations. You'll run into this a lot, is a divide by 0 error. So the first thing that we want to see is if we run this query, we're going to create a calculated number. We really want to see 2006 versus 2005, where we may have not had a great percentage of growth in particular. And you'll notice what we've got in areas where we don't have sales in our denominator, we've got issues. We've got error codes here. We've got divide by 0 errors. So we've got to fix that. We can't have our report go out looking like that. People are going to think it's broken. People are going to be calling and screaming and gnashing their teeth. So the best way to do that is to add an if statement where basically we check and say if this division, if this member actually looks like 0, if our denominator is going to be 0, then set it to null, and then go ahead and let it process. We want to make sure that we avoid any kind of divide by 0 errors, and by doing that, Now you'll notice we added a column here to show the right value. You'll notice that all these values now come back as null. We could have changed that and not had it say null. We could have changed that and had it, say something totally different, like could not calculate or something like that. We could have flipped the value back with a scope statement to a string and made some cool thing happen there. But typically you flip it to a null because you may want to exclude it based on the fact that that it is null. The important thing to remember is that you can just test for 0, because if it's null or 0, null equals 0 returns true. So if it tries to evaluate the denominator, if the denominator is null or if it's 0, it'll return correctly and you should get what you need. A couple things to point out about using this if statement. If any of you have been to a tuning analysis services or MDX session either that we've done or that anybody else has done, you may have heard them rail on a little bit about the if statement and how it's got some performance challenges and some other things. It does have some performance challenges. If you're using very large sets, if can have a bit of an issue. If you look out on the SQLcat website, sqlcat.com, there is a Analysis Services 2008 R2 performance guide that talks about that more in depth and where you should avoid using if and et cetera. Also, Jeffrey Wang is one of the developers for the Analysis Services team. He's got a great blog post out there explaining how the if function works under the covers, and it's very in depth, but it also does give you some good thought processes and ideas around how that's going to work. So let's move on to something a little bit cooler. So one of the things that sometimes we want to do is be able to emphasize cells based on their values. So that way data analysis gets easier. We're going to be able to combine, best of charts and tables, and we can still see the values while we have additional color information about the value in each cell. So a typical case here is really going to be highlighting the background of cells with green or red or yellow for good or bad results. It's fairly trivial in Excel to be able to do that. It's also not that hard in MDX. So the thing I'm going to show you next is going to be a good example on how to do that. So we've got this member create statement here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and I'm going to go over to bids and open up my cube. And you'll notice I'm in my calculation tab here in bids. I'm just going to go over to the script view. And I'm going to pick a little empty spot here for my calculation. And we're just going to paste this in. All right? And I'm going to go ahead and deploy this, and while it's deploying, I'll explain what we're going to do. We're going to create a new measure called gross profit formatted. It's going to work just like the gross profit measure, with the exception that we're going to include some additional color items that are going to give us some really cool functionality here.